Ready or not, winter has arrived in the inland Northwest. And if the early weeks of the season are any indication, it's going to be a long one. Skiers and ski resorts are happy, while many snowbirds are preparing for their annual exodus. As we near the new year, many questions about what lies ahead persist. What will happen with inflation? Is a recession imminent? How will the housing market respond? Many unknowns remain on the horizon. But here in the inland Northwest, we aren't afraid of a little adversity. We are nothing if not resilient, resourceful, and perseverant. At the Journal of Business, we endeavor to keep you, our readers, informed about what's happening in your community. Our staff is dedicated to providing you with objective information on news and trends, with the goal of helping you be more successful on your chosen path. It's time to go beyond the sound bites. It's time for more depth than 140 characters can provide. It's time for elevating the conversation.
Well, good afternoon and welcome again to Elevating the Conversation. My name is Paul Reed. I'm honored to be publisher of the Journal of Business. I'm also honored that each month so many of you choose to join us for a few minutes for some great conversations about issues affecting the business community here in Spokane. You know, we launched this series about 2 years ago for that very reason, because you asked us for a venue in which to have those conversations. And we've had some great speakers over the last couple of years, including Stephanie Curran, Dr. Frank Velezquez, Shelley O'Quinn, Jim Frank, Steve Scranton, Larry Crowder, Chef Chad White, and many, many others. Next month, we have Katie Brouillet, Chief Human Resources Officer at Washington Trust Bank, to have a conversation about talent acquisition, always a hot topic right now. But today, we're very pleased to have with us Tom Simpson, CEO of Ignite Northwest, for a discussion about Spokane's entrepreneurial ecosystem. This topic is so critical to our economy. Spokane is beginning to be very comfortable in its entrepreneurial skin, and we have far more resources than we used to have and far more successes. So this should be a very compelling conversation. But before we get to that, I want to thank Numerica Credit Union for sponsoring this month's Elevating the Conversation. We don't get to do these things without some great partners, and Numerica has always been a great partner of the Journal of Business. Today, I'm pleased to have with us Mike Shortell, Vice President and Team Leader for SBA and Business Banking at Numerica, to say a few words. Welcome, Mike.
Hello, my name is Mike Shortell, and I'm the Numerica Credit Union's Business Banking and SBA Team Lead. We're here today to talk about entrepreneurship and the keys to success in building your own business. Thank you, Spokane Journal of Business, for leading these conversations, and to Tom Simpson, CEO of Ignite Northwest, for sharing his expertise this afternoon. I've been in the financial industry for more than 20 years. Something I'm passionate about is helping people find success in growing their small businesses. Something I'm really proud of is Numerica was the top credit union across Washington and North Idaho for SBA loans in 2022. The SBA Loan Guarantee Program is a great tool to help get capital to businesses that otherwise might not qualify for a commercial loan. In 2022, we assisted many entrepreneurs in achieving their dream of being their own boss. Many of you are here with a business idea that could benefit from obtaining additional capital. Here are 3 qualities lenders will look for to determine if a new business is creditworthy: experience, equity, and secondary sources of repayment. Let's start with experience. How does your previous work experience relate to the business you're now trying to start? This might come from office, personnel, or general management experience in the field your new business is in. Next is equity. SBA financing requires equity contributions of anywhere from 10% to 30% of the total project costs for all startup requests. Equity sources can include personal or retirement savings, gifts from family members, or other non-borrowed cash funds. Lastly, revenues for your startup business are projection-based. Secondary sources of repayment are typically required to supplement the projected cash flow during the startup phase. This can include wages from a different job, spouse's income, retirement income, or Social Security. So whether you came today because you have an idea or are looking for ways to help your business take off, we're glad you're here. Being a part of the conversation like this is how Numerica lives out its core purpose of enhancing lives, fulfilling dreams, and building communities. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you for joining us for Elevating the Conversation this afternoon. My name is Lynn Parrish. I'm the editor of the Journal of Business, and I'm here today with Tom Simpson. Ignite Northwest, although CEO of Ignite Northwest is not exactly all you do. So it's good to have you here with us to share your wealth of knowledge on this important topic.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I very much appreciate the invitation, and particularly with the prestigious group of other speakers that you've had. So
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
But I wear a number of hats here in Spokane. One is CEO of Ignite Northwest.
Sure.
I also manage the Spokane Angel Alliance.
Right.
And then I run a family of angel investment funds called Kickstart to kickstart kind of the early capital formation of startups in our community.
Sure. How long have you been doing the Angel Alliance now?
It dates back, my participation dates back to about 2008. Prior to that, there's a group called the Delta Angel Group.
Sure.
And I was invited one day to participate in that and perhaps build it up. And I did, and I changed the name to the Spokane Angel Alliance.
Now, this is getting a little bit off track, but I was curious to know, was your participation in that kind of have its roots in some of the momentum efforts of the late 80s and early 90s?
You know, that's really a good question. I don't know if the Delta Angel Group was an offshoot from that, but many of the other things that I'm doing do date back to that. In fact, the reason I moved from Seattle to Spokane in 1995 is because Dave Clark, who was very involved in Momentum, called me up one day and asked if I would consider coming back and running what was then called Spokane Capital Management, which was a small fund, an angel fund, to help revitalize the Spokane economy back in the 80s. And it had been fully invested. The individual that was running it had left, and Dave called me to come back to Spokane to see if I wanted to run it, and I did. And so that's what got me back to Spokane. And really, Dave Clark's mentorship has really inspired me to do many of the other things I've done since then.
Oh, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. Well, we're already off the rails, but I'm kind of, I'm okay with it.
That's good. That's what entrepreneurs do.
Yeah.
You know, you zig and zag.
Yeah. You know, and when we were preparing for this, or when I was thinking about our conversation, one of the things I was thinking about is how your role has evolved, you know, going from just the Angel Alliance and expanding with Kickstart, and then to Ignite, where you're really an advocate for the entrepreneurial ecosystem, wouldn't you say? And so I was curious to know, do you think that startup community has changed most profoundly over the last 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I think it's really changed profoundly in a slow but growing recognition that startups and entrepreneurship and emerging companies is important to our community.
Sure.
It's always been a belief that's important, but perhaps not a laser focus on it.
Sure.
And as people have seen the things that I've done and others have done in the community, not only here but in Coeur d'Alene and in other parts of our region, and the companies that have been funded and the success, and some of them become more household names, there's more recognition that it works.
Sure.
That by mentoring and funding and encouraging these companies, they do produce new businesses that hire people that help diversify our economy.
Sure, sure. And I think when you start to see that profile raised, part of it is when you see some of those companies starting to translate into more jobs in the community. You were involved heavily in Green Cupboards, which became E-Tails, and which became Caspian. And then you've seen a few others where it starts to become a couple hundred jobs in the community. And do you see that as one of the ways that it's uh, gained some more recognition in the business community as a whole?
Absolutely. As people see these emerging companies, and I'll just give an example. Spiceology,
Sure.
become a household name. They have a better appreciation for what a focus on emerging growth and startups can translate into.
Sure.
And frankly, the Spokane Journal of Business has played a role in that, because you help echo and build awareness to a number of these companies, and the Journal does a great job of covering them, and that helps get the news out. So
Sure.
it's you and your paper have played a big part in that.
Yeah, thank you. It's become it's a little different conversation, because when you think about business news value, a lot of times you are thinking about jobs or companies that have a large physical presence,
Yep.
or millions or tens of millions of dollars in revenue, and so you have to gauge startups with a little different lens in terms of what the blue sky is.
Right,
so to speak.
right.
So,
But they're interesting new stories. They're new
Fascinating.
products. They're people with interesting backgrounds. So even though there might be some blue sky there, they're a good read.
yeah, for sure. And to be candid, they do well. So.
Yep.
Yeah. So you mentioned. So I'm just hopping all over the place now, but you
I
mentioned,
appreciate that. I'm not really a straight line guy.
You mentioned Spiceology, which brings up one of the questions I had, where when you think about startups, you think about tech, and certainly every business that's starting these days has a tech aspect to it. But Spiceology is one where tech isn't at its core.
Right.
So what do you see as the potential for in Spokane, or how would you describe the makeup of our startup community in terms of tech versus non-tech?
Yep. Your observation about technology, really every company has some component of tech.
It has
But
to.
are they using tech or are they developing tech is somewhat the separation between the two. In Spokane, I personally look at, we've got some concentrations in some tech industries, maybe cybersecurity, healthcare services, but really we've got a pretty diverse cross-section of emerging companies in Spokane. You mentioned Spiceology, there's Revival Tea, there's Slate Dental, Gestalt, Vega. It's really, it's diverse. And I project it's going to continue to be that way, not really reliant upon one sector.
Sure. And if you look historically at tech or spin-offs in the Spokane area, what I think about anyway is a lot related to energy. So you think about the old Washington Water Power spin-offs that became some large employers that are still with us today, the Itrons and NG,
and
exactly.
Rely On.
Exactly.
It's really interesting. Vista, I'm saying this anecdotally, but so many investor-owned utilities have tried to diversify over the years. And I've got to believe Vista probably has one of the best track records. I mean, the number of companies which I just mentioned that they have successfully spun out, and they're incubating a few more now as well. So I presume, or I expect we'll see more.
Sure, yeah. And there's a couple we haven't even mentioned.
Right.
Yeah. But that does lead to another line of questioning, which is, are there any veins or industry niches that you see as having great potential in the Spokane market right now? The diversity is amazing, but are there any of those where we see a real strength in the startup community?
Well, I mentioned cybersecurity and healthcare services, and you just recently wrote an article on cybersecurity and that cluster, and healthcare services. And I expect to see those continue to grow, particularly on the healthcare side with 2 medical schools here in Spokane and 2 large hospitals and nursing schools. And so I expect, we have some concentration, and I expect to see them grow. But I also see a number of other companies just kind of cropping up in different pockets in different areas as people come up with ideas or they move here. It's hard to predict.
Yeah, yeah, I bet it is. I bet it is. Hey, before I forget, we have a question and answer feature in our chat where you can put questions for Tom. And when we get done with our conversation, we'll ask him a few of those, but feel free to type those in at any time. So looking at a little bit broader question, I wonder, what do you see as some of the strengths and weaknesses in the startup community now? We talked about diversity, which is a strength.
Yep.
Anything else that comes to mind?
You know, I'm going to back up a little bit and maybe
Sure.
answer the question a little differently.
Sure.
Because I get that question a lot. One of the weaknesses we used to, that would frequently come up is the challenges in finding talent here in Spokane.
Oh, sure.
And it was somewhat on both sides of the equation. If I am a company here in Spokane, can I really find the right marketing people, the right engineering people, and all the talent I need? And on the other end of the equation, another thing I saw quite frequently is perhaps a company here in Spokane was trying to recruit someone from the Bay Area. And that individual might have a significant other. And sometimes we would not be able to get the individual we wanted because they were concerned that the significant other came to Spokane, that individual would not find employment opportunities. The pandemic has been good for Spokane in that regard, because now work remote has been embraced.
Sure.
So now a Spokane company, for example, can really hire anywhere.
Sure.
They can hire someone around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Same point in time, if someone is considering relocating, they can move to Spokane, still work for their company in Seattle or the Bay Area, or their spouse can. And that's been one of the biggest challenges. But now that's gone.
Mm-hmm.
That's no longer a factor. So I tend to look at things with rose-colored glasses. I don't see a lot of challenges. So many people are looking for a work-life balance.
Sure.
And this community offers that.
Yeah.
And I talk frequently to a lot of venture funds from up and down the West Coast and other places, and they're looking for opportunities off the beaten path.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't see a whole lot of different challenges. We don't have the critical mass that a Seattle or other places have.
Sure.
So you don't have all the kind of the rubbing elbows with all the other entrepreneurs, but with all the communications, the physical contact is becoming less important.
Sure.
So I think the pandemic and the technology changes is all embracing the success of companies in smaller market like ours to still succeed.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. And something I hadn't thought through thoroughly. So that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. I wanted to go to the money side of it for a minute and talk about, you mentioned early on how some of the investment funds worked. And so my impression is at that time, there were not a lot of sources for venture capital in the Spokane market specifically. I get the feeling that has changed dramatically through the years, to the point where there's almost more money than there are ideas. Is that the case? I mean, what's the supply and demand there?
Let me step back. Where one of the hardest times or places for a company to raise money is in the seed or the pre-seed stage. Very early, when it's still an idea, maybe a prototype, a smattering of a team, probably no revenues.
Sure.
And that is the most challenging time to secure capital, because most of the dominant venture funds, they don't, their funds are so big and their check sizes are so large, they just can't devote time to putting $250,000 or $500,000 into a brand new idea.
Sure.
And that's part of the reason I started the Kickstart Angel Funds a number of years ago. It was a way to pool some of my capital and others in the community such so that I could kickstart the capital formation process.
Sure.
And the real challenge at that early stage is having someone to roll up the sleeves, do the due diligence, write the term sheet, structure the deal. And that was the void that Kickstart was intended to fill. And we've done that successfully. And other pockets of funds have emerged. The Coles family here in Spokane are very, very active angel investors.
Sure.
So with that, with Kickstart, with some other funding sources, the Spokane Angel Alliance, we do now have that covered. Now, when companies get further along, a Series A or a Series B, you're correct. The world is frankly awash with capital. There is record numbers of amount of cash on the sideline, but it's just not at the early stage.
Sure.
You've proven yourself. You've got some revenues. You can secure capital from VC firms from around the country.
Sure. And do we see much money coming into Spokane from outside of the area?
Yeah. I think most recently, I believe you reported on Vega Cloud here in Spokane,
Sure.
a company that I seeded very early on. Recently received capital from Album Ventures in Salt Lake City, and
Sure.
and there's a number of examples of firms from outside the area funding companies in our region.
Okay. Great. One of the challenges that we have as a news source is it's hard to quantify activity in this realm. So we can look at PitchBook, which is a fantastic resource, but as far as a composite of everything that's happening, it's not like when we can go to building permits and say there was X million dollars of permits issued this year, or this number of bankruptcies or something like that. So how would you describe the trend in venture capital activity in our market this year compared to last year or previous years or pre-pandemic? However you think it would be.
I actually do track that stuff.
Yeah, I'm sure you do.
No, it's all approximate.
Yeah.
It's an inaccurate science because I don't have the data. I don't have all the data.
Sure.
But I do track the deals that the companies that present to the SAA, and I actually just updated that. I believe in 2022, 10 companies raised about $5 million from members of the Spokane Angel Alliance and another $20 million from other investors.
Okay.
If I compare that to other years, the year before might have been a bit higher, but that was 2021. That's the year when we had all the initial public offerings, we had SPACs. So within, if I look at any 2 or 3 years, it might be like this. If I look at a longer trend, it's definitely upward to the right.
Okay.
There is definitely more activity, and I monitor it not only in this list that I keep, but I also monitor it in terms of the time I'm dedicated. And I am almost at the point now where there's too much opportunity out there for me and my team to really manage as timely as we'd like. There's just a lot of interesting up and coming new companies.
Fascinating. So just a little bit of a kind of a inside baseball or peek around behind the curtain for those who may not know how it works. How does it work when a company comes to Spokane Angel Alliance? You mentioned 10 companies, $5 million from members. And what I'm picturing is that members hear the pitch, have the option to invest individually or not at all. How does that all work?
It's somewhat informal. When companies present at the SAA, in some cases I'm involved through Kickstart. I've done some of the analysis. I've written a term sheet, and it's easy for people to follow. Now there may be some companies that weren't aren't at that stage, and either someone else has to step up or they form their own syndicate. I view my role as leading the horse to water, but
Okay.
really letting other people make their own decision.
Uh,
These are, of course, high-risk investments.
sure.
And so I'm somewhat cautious about really twisting arms for people to come into these deals. So
Sure.
I do the work, I do the matchmaking, and people can join me, but in many cases it's somewhat up to them. But it is, it's a smaller community. The Spokane Angel Alliance is, maybe 100 members. So if people are interested, it's not too hard to find me or contact the team and get
Sure.
involved.
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. And I think a lot of, like, the average Joe, what they know about investment is what they see on Shark Tank, and the impression that I get is that it's quite a different dynamic than.
Don't
than that.
even get me started. One thing about, and I've been involved in venture capital investing or angel investing for a long time.
Mhm.
And when you do that, you're saying no way more times than you say yes.
Sure.
And if you say no in a mean or nasty or disparaging way, after about 6 months, no one's going to knock on your door anymore, because
Sure.
the reputation is going to get out that that guy is not nice. So when I meet with companies, and if I end up passing and not investing, I try to do it in the most constructive, value-added, diplomatic way I can. And try to give them some hints, give them some guidance, give them constructive criticism,
Sure.
perhaps make some introductions for them, such that they walk away going, I didn't get capital, but you know what, I got some value out of it. I compared that to the sharks on Shark Tank.
Sure.
The way they treat and talk to some of these people, if they weren't already billionaires and had to do that for a living, they would be out of business very, very quickly.
Sure. Sure.
So it's reality TV,
Yeah.
and it doesn't bear a whole lot of resemblance to real world angel or venture investing.
Sure. Sure.
I hope Mark Cuban watches this and gives me a call and scolds me.
I don't know. Is he in the Zoom? Well, I want to get to other people's questions here pretty quick, but I did want to ask you about one thing, and I wanted to get your take on the value of the startup weekends, or the events that we see popping up, where it gives people an opportunity to learn how to pitch.
Yep.
Make a pitch,
Yep.
maybe flesh out a business idea a little bit more. We have a few of those that happen in our community, and I haven't talked to you about this before, but I was just curious to see what you see as the value in those.
Well, given that I organize a lot of those, you're going to get a very favorable response. Startup Weekend had been around for a number of years.
Sure.
And through Ignite, we brought it back last year. We called it Sparks Weekend. We rebranded it. I think it's a magnificent experience, because it enables entrepreneurs who might have an idea in the back of their mind to practice pitching it. And also, if they're selected, to be paired with a legitimate mentor here in Spokane and spend the entire weekend, flushing out their idea and their business model. And I know the people that went through it when we did it earlier this year. Fantastic experience. It's a great training ground. So I think that event is very rewarding to the people that go through it.
Sure. Great.
Yeah.
Great. Let's see. Do we have any questions yet, Paul?
We do. First question is from Washington Donnell. How do you leverage talent and expose unethical behavior and fraud that exists in the microcosm to ensure integrity within the ecosystem?
Fortunately, I haven't dealt with that very often. I guess I try to identify that early on, and ideally only work with people that have a certain level of ethics where that's not going to happen. For example, I'm in the midst of potentially investing in a company here in Spokane. Did some reference checks on previous employers today, doing a background check. So, really on the early end, you try to find people that ideally you're not going to get yourself in that circumstance. Now, and knock on wood, in my career, have we had fraud or some bad behavior? Occasionally, but it's rare. When it's discovered, it's not tolerated, and it is mitigated as soon as possible.
Sure, sure. Now, when you talk about fraud in that instance, are you talking about people who are trying to scam the investors, or who have practices that may be questionable?
All the above.
Okay.
Scam the investors, unethical practices, stealing company funds.
Sure.
And knock on, unfortunately, I've only ran into it in isolated instances.
Yeah. Good.
Question from Matt McCoy. Hey, Matt, how you doing? Does Spokane and our region do enough to promote and support international business?
Another question I don't get very frequently. And it's not really my domain expertise. A number of my companies are selling internationally. Typically, however, the companies I'm involved with are really trying to get a foothold domestically. And
Sure.
once they've successfully demonstrated that sell internationally. A number of my companies either have contract workers or employees that might live internationally. Bringing international businesses into Spokane, I know there are efforts underway to do that, but not something that I'm directly involved with.
Yeah, it's a good question though, because I think that's probably a market that's changed dramatically through the pandemic.
Yep.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt.
And a question from Gavin Wheeler. What are some of the best avenues for promoting new innovative products to companies within the Spokane network?
That's a good question, and I do really believe that I often advise companies with a new product or service to really try to sell it here in Spokane. Years ago, Spokane was actually a real tested ground for a lot of new products. The best avenues, that's a constantly changing dynamic. How you embrace the newest tools on social media. And that's not something I'm not necessarily an expert in, but there are all the platforms out there: LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and it seems like and video and text, and it seems like it's always evolving. Fortunately, there are a number of kind of experts in Spokane. There's Tribe Media Labs and Talk Fast Social and Houdini and all these other firms that have kind of cropped up here that are really working with entrepreneurs to get the word out in the best way. And I'm perhaps a little old school, so typically I suggest that one of the companies I'm working with that is trying to do that to engage one of the firms that I just mentioned or others.
Sure.
And from Rick Rep, more of a prompt than a question, but hey, Rick, good to hear from you. This would be a good opportunity to describe the role of the Ignite Loan Fund.
Well, thank you, Rick. The Ignite Loan Fund. We have two loan funds, which quite frankly is not necessarily meaningful to the outside world, but we have nearly $5 million in capital that came from a grant from the Department of Commerce that is earmarked to provide loans, non-dilutive capital, to emerging companies that have been turned down by a bank.
Okay.
They're looking for debt capital, but they've been turned down by the bank. So these funds are really help to spur economic development for these businesses. And it's really been a great source of capital. And if I look at many of the more successful companies that have gone from that pre-seed maybe to a Series A in Spokane, Many of them have secured capital from Ignite. Spiceology, Risklens, Gestalt, Medcurity, and several others.
Sure.
It's a great program. So thanks, Rick, for asking the question.
And from Chris Kelly, is Sparks Weekend still connected to the global Techstars ecosystem and benefits?
Sparks Weekend is independent of Startup Weekend and Techstars.
Okay.
There's some similarities between the two. We have really changed the objective, or one of the objectives of Sparks, such that the winner receives some investment capital to deploy as they start the company.
Okay. Sure.
So it's a bit of a different concept.
And from Rob Allen, hey Rob, have you had any success with potential new businesses springing up out of the local medical schools and their research arms?
Good question.
Not directly so far. I've not directly had a company whose technology has been developed. Now, I do have an exception. I invested in a company called Inherent Biosciences,
Okay.
whose technology came out of WSU. Years ago, I invested in a company called Pacific Northwest Biotechnology
Okay.
that had some therapies for Alzheimer's that also came out of WSU, but not in recent times. No, I've funded students that have come out of the programs, but not necessarily technology that came out of that, other than the two I mentioned.
Sure. But I know that has been a focal point of,
Yeah.
of the schools.
Yep.
And so it might be something that's on the horizon.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I am aspiring to be able to partner with the med schools to help them identify, fund, and commercialize technologies.
Yeah. Fantastic.
From Steve Watts, thanks for the question. Steve, are you grooming anyone or considering grooming someone to initially assist and eventually succeed you, given the very important role you play in advancing new businesses in the region?
Well, I thought Steve Watts would be a great person for that. That's a very good question. I don't intend to really stop doing this in the near term. I do recognize I have somewhat of a unique skill set. I'm constantly keeping my eyes open for someone like that. There's a few people in the community I do have my eye on that at some point in time could step in.
Sure.
The most important component is not necessarily an accounting or finance background to understand this. The most important component is really the willingness to be somewhat a community volunteer and work in the community. And that's where I was inspired by Dave Clack so many years ago, who still is, my number one mentor, and really the importance of community involvement. And so as I look at people, I've got to find someone who is just naturally and innately passionate about working not only with entrepreneurs, but also kind of giving back to the community.
Sure.
And that's not something, that's not a quality that everybody possesses.
Sure. But you're a CPA by training.
I am.
Correct?
That's how I started my career.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so how has that translated into what you do now, or has it?
Well, I personally believe, I kind of advocate anybody getting a business degree as an undergraduate, get their CPA. It's whether or not you want to become an accountant, it is a tangible discipline. And even if you want to go into sales or marketing or management or something like that, understanding a balance sheet and an income statement and a cash flow statement will be invaluable. And the fact that you have that accounting concentration and maybe even your CPA certificate is going to differentiate you throughout your career. So I started out, I frankly don't really know how I kind of ended up being kind of a CPA to what I do now.
Sure.
I took some wrong turns around the road along the way, but I'm delighted I did.
Yeah, sure. Great.
And a final question from Victoria O'Banion. How do you support co-op development in the Inland Northwest?
Oh, interesting.
I'm going to need a little more clarification on what she means by co-op development.
Well, can I guess?
Yeah.
I don't know Victoria, she's not a plant, but what I would guess is we've seen some development like what Luke Baumgartner
Yep.
and some of his partners are doing in terms of co-op ownership of a diverse group of businesses. And I would guess that's what she's talking about, is something like that where employees have a ownership stake and
I'm familiar with Luke's model. Sure. Having all employees have an ownership stake in an entity is vastly important. Years ago as an investment banker, I did a number of ESOPs. In fact, I once did the ESOP of Rosar Supermarkets, where it was a structure where the employees bought the supermarket. So I'm very familiar with a number of different mechanisms by which to enable and ensure that the employees have a stake in a business. Now, where for me, the real, and I think that's good, it's healthy, it creates alignment of interest, where my interest comes is it a lifestyle business or is it an explosively growing business? And neither one of them are right or wrong. Sure. There's some companies that, hey, you know what? We're a lifestyle business. We're going to grow this thing. We're all going to work together. We're going to own it together. We're going to share the profits. That's wonderful. There are other businesses that perhaps might be more capitally intense, and their intent is to really skyrocket their growth and at some point in time, go public or be acquired, such that there is a return on the investment of the investor's capital. And I can't focus on everything, and neither model is superior to the other. I'm really focused on capital formation by investors. The company might have a lot of employee owners, but the companies need capital. They take it from my sources. I help advise them. They grow, and at some point in time, they go public or they're sold. So if in the co-op model, the intent is the employees are going to own it, it's a co-op, but at some point in time, there's going to be a liquidity event, then those objectives are aligned with the investors that I might bring to the table.
Sure. Great answer, actually.
Thank you.
So Victoria added cooperative startup Treehouse just became a cooperative and is a good example. So
I'll look into it. Thank you.
And we'll throw in one more question, just because she's such a great person, and that's Nadine Burgess. And Nadine says, hey, thanks for sharing this afternoon. Our community is fortunate to have you, Tom. Question not necessarily in regards to the entrepreneurial ecosystem, but in general, are there any books that you would regularly recommend?
Well, I'm a little bit relieved by her question because I was fearful she was going to ask me to do a headstand. And I can do a headstand, but I cannot do a handstand like she. So I'm glad she didn't ask me to do that. Books. One of my favorite books is 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel. Great book. It's a quick read. Peter was one of the very founders of PayPal, one of the very early investors in Facebook. Another great book is called The Secrets of Silicon Valley. So anybody trying to kind of get in the mindset of a venture capitalist and about what they're thinking, that's a great book. I recently read Reed Hastings, the founder of Netflix, No Rules Rules. Shoe Dog by Phil Knight of Nike.
Sure. Yeah.
Great book. I love reading books by successful entrepreneurs, and a few that I just threw out there are among my favorites. Early on, Pour Your Heart Into It by Howard Schultz, another great book.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I'll give one book that just came out. I haven't read it, but it's on my list. Is Todd Finkel, Tenured professor in entrepreneurship at Gonzaga, just wrote a book on Warren Buffett. So,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, 11 shopping days. So.
There you go. Exactly.
Well, Tom, thanks for joining us today. It was great to see you, and I always appreciate your insights.
Well, thank you for having me. Very
Yeah.
much appreciate it. Good partnership.
You bet. And thanks for joining us. Please join us in January when Katie Brouillet joins us to talk about talent acquisition in the Inland Northwest. Until then, have happy holidays. Have a strong start to your new year, and we'll see you in 2023.